Are your communities welcoming for Latinx people? If not, what might be the effects on adolescents and adults' development and health? Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychology findings to a diverse range of contemporary issues in bettering your life. Today's guest is Dr. Andrea Romero, who was the 2020-21 president of NLPA, which is the National Latinx Psychological Association. Dr. Romero is Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Professor of Family Studies and Human Development at the University of Arizona. So, over the years, she's conducted a bunch of empirical studies focused on social and cultural factors that influence adolescent development and health. Frequently, those are in respect to Latinx, and sometimes more specifically, Mexican individuals and youth. She has even created a measure of bicultural stress. Along the way, Dr. Romero found that, yes, discrimination does have a negative effect on mental health and risky behaviors, but less so on adolescents who have strong ethnic identity. We're going to talk about that more today in this episode. Dr. Romero, welcome to Psych Everywhere.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I was really excited to do this topic. I was looking to do an episode sort of Hispanic Heritage Month, and I was looking for one for Suicide Prevention Month, which ends today. We're recording this on September 30. And I found you, and you cover both topics wonderfully. So I'll just start off with kind of an easy one that I think people might be interested in. Could you share a little about, I know there's been more confusion lately about saying Latinx or Latino or Hispanic. Which of those do you think preferred, or which is the safe one to go with people?
I think it really depends on who you're talking to, because there is a lot of different opinions, even within the Latinx community across the United States. So it really depends on who your audience is. And, people who are within higher education, like myself, and especially our national organization, the National Latinx Psychological Association, we found that there was a lot of awareness about being non-gender binary and about use of pronouns. And so that's really how the term Latinx came about, is that it is a way to move away from the gender binary of saying Latino, Latina. And so that was a movement from within our membership. We have about 1,000 members that participate with us. Many of those are in higher ed. Many of those are in counseling practice themselves too. They're practitioners. And so it really came from within the membership that there was a need and a desire to change our term, and really for us to kind of lead the way to raise more awareness about gender identity within our community, and also to embrace our LGBTQ members as well, so that there really was a sense of being seen and greater awareness about the issues on those topics. Now, certainly out in general community, outside of higher ed, outside of counseling practice, there are many people who are less familiar with the term Latinx. The term Hispanic still seems to be rolling around, certainly in government documents, but there generally is more of a move to the use of the term Latino, Latina, Latinx, rather than Hispanic. There's many writings out there that have debunked some of the issues with the term Hispanic, and just one of those being that the root is from Spain rather than from Latin America.
What do you feel are some of the biggest stress-causing challenges that Latinx children and adults face regarding their mental health?
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and really a good precursor for taking a deeper dive, looking at things like suicidality. So everyone experiences stress, right? Children, especially teenagers, especially have unique forms of stress. And it's a lot of the normal kind of stuff, right? Maybe stress at school, stress with dating, maybe some stress within the family. But on top of those things, our research with Latinx youth and children has shown that there's other factors that are really important and predictive of depressive symptoms and suicidality. And that includes, most importantly, discrimination or perception of bias against them. And so that could be things like being treated differently in school by teachers or by other adults, maybe feeling that their grades are affected because of bias from teachers, or maybe even just not being included, not being called on. Also, sometimes being targeted within stores where people are followed, or there's assumptions that maybe they might be doing something they shouldn't be just because of how they look, or even that sort of treatment by police, or for those of us who live in the border areas, by Border Patrol, being targeted and treated differently and questioned more often. And so those sort of things are definitely stress causing for children and youth. But even other forms that we today might call microaggressions, things like negative stereotypes or ethnic jokes, those kind of things are rated really high, commonly experienced by youth and children. And I think what we've seen in the last 5 years or so is that there is increased hostile rhetoric against Latinos in general within our political context and, on the news and many other kind of social media sources as well. When youth are on social media, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or, any of these other, Snapchat, these sort of things also get passed around in memes or comments that people make. And so all of those are really significantly stress inducing. The other big one that affects many children and youth, and Latinx children and youth particularly, is that of being bullied. So not just the cyberbullying that I mentioned through, often through social media, but also being bullied in person. Whether it's in school or after school or in their neighborhood. But those are kind of big key issues that have been identified in research. And definitely for children and adults, another factor is just the stress that results when sometimes their cultures come into contact and are not well aligned, and there's conflicts, whether it's what language to speak or what language is supported, or maybe it's what holidays to celebrate, what foods to eat, or deeper things like family values, right? What family expectations are and how those might vary across different cultures, or how there might be different expectations in school about how you cooperate and work together versus what's expected at home. And so those kind of cultural conflicts, or cultural choques, we call them sometimes, those can be difficult to navigate, not only for children and youth, but also for adults.
You and some co-authors in 2018 published an article called Examining Suicidality, Bullying, and Gun Carrying Among Latino Youth Over 10 Years. And for the record, that was in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Could you share some of these overall findings? Like, which of those three, suicidality, bullying, and gun carrying, have these things increased over these time? Have they decreased, stayed the same?
Sure. So that research with my co-authors, that was a study of data from 10 years, from 2005 to 2015. We used the publicly available data set from the Centers for Disease Control. It's called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, YRBSS. So from that data set, we had 13,378 Latino youth over that 10-year time period. So they were grades 9 to 12. And they responded to the general questions that are in the YRBSS that ask about suicidal thoughts, suicidal plan, suicide attempts, gun carrying, bullying, and cyberbullying. And we were really interested in this topic at that time because suicide was the second leading cause of death for teens 12 to 19 years old. And it had been that Latina female youth were the ones reporting the highest rates of suicide attempts for over 40 years. So we really wanted to look at it more carefully. It was something that had been a persistent issue, and we felt like there still needed to be more research done on the topic to really understand what was going on so that we could more effectively develop interventions or increase awareness. What was really interesting today, Bradley, is that I looked up the current CDC information because I was like, I better see what things are like today to see if this is still consistent. And what's going on is that suicide is now the third leading cause, not the second, so it's gone down a little bit. It's second to accidents and homicides. Although homicide and suicide are very close in their percentage. So right now it's the third leading cause of death. And actually in the last couple of years, so our study ended in 2015, that data set, that last day was from 2015. In 2017 and 2019, the suicide attempts for Latinas actually dropped. And so they were no longer the highest group. And the highest group in 2017 and 2019 has been African American females. And, you know, that is perhaps not entirely surprising when you see what's been happening with the Black Lives Matter movement and with, you know, just all the attention and the challenges and, you know, more awareness brought to the deaths that have happened, especially related to COVID and the kind of family challenges that African Americans have experienced. And I also want to draw attention to the fact that there are also Black Latinos. And so that is another area where we need quite a bit more work, is looking at Afro-Latinx youth to really understand how race and ethnicity intersect. Race, ethnicity, gender, how all those sort of things come together and shape the experiences of our young people in the world, in society, and also in some of these other spheres, like, you know, their neighborhoods, their schools, and their families, because there's a lot at play there. There's a lot of biases that can affect the youth that are, you know, experiencing it from many different directions all at one time. So, but you asked me about the results from that study, right? So let me get back to that. Sorry, I got off track thinking about the larger context. But our study, what we showed was that overall gun carrying, and so this is on a positive note, we'll start on a positive note.
That's good.
Overall gun carrying decreased over those 10 years from 2005 to 2015 among Latinx boys. So that was a result that was hopeful for us, that gun carrying was decreased amongst Latinx boys. And suicide attempts had decreased over that time among Latino girls. And then, as I said, now even in 2017, 2019, it's gone down even more. We were really interested at that time to understand how gun carrying might be related to suicide attempts and how something like bullying might also be related to suicide attempts. So what we found is when we looked at both of those factors together, and there had been no studies before us that had looked at both gun carrying and bullying at the same time in relation to suicidality. What we found is that any youth who carried a gun were significantly more likely to report a suicide attempt, whether they had been bullied or not. And in fact, Latina girls who carried a gun were 29 times more likely to report a suicide attempt.
Whoa.
Latinx boys who carried a gun were approximately three times more likely to report a suicide attempt. So the gun carrying was a very important factor. And, when we've talked about this, we've done many trainings to our local schools. We really emphasize how important it is that if youth are caught on campus with a gun or a weapon, that it's so critical to think about restorative practices and to really check in, make sure that there's a counselor involved and see what other issues may be going on. Because so often our schools now have zero tolerance, and youth move very quickly to being suspended or expelled and removed from the school situation without there being any immediate addressing of other mental health issues or other kind of things that may be going on for the young person. So this kind of information is really important and really informative, especially for schools, but also for anyone working within juvenile justice areas to be aware of this kind of information so that we can really do the best and the right thing by our young people. We also found, again, not surprisingly, because this had been the trend for a long time, Latina girls were more likely to attempt suicide than boys, and also more likely to report that they had been bullied and cyberbullied, although they were less likely to carry a gun. And I'm sure you know, as I'm sure many people on the podcast are well aware too, that we were very concerned about gun carrying because it is something that is linked to a completed suicide. So it's something that, especially for young people who may make a suicide attempt because of what we might consider impulsive reactions. So it's something that, of the moment they're having, very intense emotions, and it's hard to see the future. And, those attempts with a gun are much more severe consequences than through other methods. So we really wanted to hone into on what was going on in those kind of environments where youth have access to and are carrying a gun. In general, both boys and girls who were reported being bullied were approximately 3 times more likely to report a suicide attempt. And I know we've done a lot of efforts in the last several years to draw attention to bullying and to prevent bullying. So I'm hopeful that part of those activities and that prevention work is what's factoring into the reduced suicide attempts for Latina girls and Latina boys in the last couple of years.
So, what are some things people could do in their places of work, in their communities, to just make things more welcoming for Latinx families?
Yeah, so that's a great idea because I love that question because it gets at those topics of discrimination and bias and not being inclusive by saying, what can we do to be more inclusive? How can we welcome people? And hopefully not even just welcome, but really embrace people and embrace the culture. And so Hispanic Heritage Month is a great time to do that because there are often many activities and really fun, things that are going on in the community or that could be built into community activities to really celebrate Hispanic heritage, the culture, the food, the people, the holidays. Here in Tucson, we celebrated Dia de Independencia, which is the 16th of September. And so there was a beautiful event where they had the Tucson Symphony play music by Mexican composers, and they gave, explanations and history of these different composers. You got to hear the music, and then they did the very traditional grito at the end of Viva Mexico and, lists of all the different historical figures from that time. So it's a great way to come together, to celebrate, to learn about Mexican history and heritage, and also to enjoy things like music and art and food and good company. So those kind of events that really are authentic, that really honor, and bring together people to learn more information in a way that's fun and exciting, those are fantastic. Trying to stay away from the things where it's like, oh, we'll just put a sombrero on. Those are not as authentic, and often, people will feel that it creates more bias. So we have to be really informed when we do activities like that, making sure that we are carrying forward authentic information, and especially sharing kind of the rich culture, heritage, language, food, music, all those different dimensions in a way that people feel really welcome. A great way to do this with Latinx families, if there's, some activities that the youth are doing to really showcase the work of the young people. And for us in Tucson, again, sometimes that means young people who play in a mariachi, or they do ballet folklorico, or, they're doing some other kind of activity, so we can really showcase what they're doing and what they're learning. And that's a great way to bring parents in, and also a great way to bring families together across many different cultures. I think, there's a lot of also great movies and different things out there. If people are interested and they want to learn more about the history, of course, one movie is not going to tell you everything, but there are some really great ones out there. And there's some really great ones in the last several years, like there's the great one about Cesar Chavez. There was a new one about Dolores Huerta. So those were both leaders in the United Farm Workers movement to have better rights and health for farm workers. So things like that really get to, cultural figures. There's a great one about Walkout, and talks about the civil rights history of the Latinx community in California, where the students walked out of the school because they felt they weren't being treated fairly in the school. And it gives a lot of the authentic history behind those moments and what happened. McFarland is a true story as well. And then there's also the one that is about the Latinx boys that build the robot. And I'm blanking on the name of that movie too, but that's another super fun one. I always loved, we did a whole thing where we created a movie series during the pandemic, and we brought together a lot of teenagers and everybody watched the movies. And then we did a virtual space to talk about what they saw and what they thought about the movies. And for us, of course, the first movie we started with was Selena. So everybody knows her music, and they know her image, and, it tells her life story. And so, sometimes things like that, especially with youth or teenagers, to make it really fun, inviting, build off of something that they already know, and engage them in, discussion. What are their thoughts? What are their views about it? What would they do in that situation? There's also some really great new shows on Netflix. There's the Selena series that's on Netflix. That was really fun. I watched it with my boys, my teenage boys, and they got really caught up. They're like, how could she do that to her family? And they had opinions about everything. And then there's some other really great ones too. Gentification, I think is how you pronounce it. Mm-hmm. But that's a really great one that really talks about gentrification happening. It's a fictionalized story, but it follows a family who has a restaurant in an area of LA where the area is being gentrified. There's some really great, opportunities out there to learn, to participate, to engage in discussion. And I think those things go a long way when you talk with people. The hardest thing, I think, is even when you do all that, you can't assume. You can't assume, you can't stereotype people. A lot of people will come to me and they'll be like, you must be a good cook. And they know nothing about me. I'm like, why would you say that? Because the stereotype is, that maybe Latina women are all good cooks. Or they would, without knowing, they might say, oh, how do you make, this kind of food? How do you make tamales? How do you make enchiladas? Well, not all Latinos make those foods, and not all Latinos are, people who cook. Making sure to not make assumptions, meet people where they're at, being humanistic with them goes a long way for people to feel welcomed. I think the one topic I haven't really addressed yet that I do want to make sure that I address is that of immigration. So, and this has been a big factor with the rhetoric that we've heard in the last many years, the negative stereotypes that have been promulgated even by some of our politicians, negative views of immigrants. And so that is something that does cause a lot of stress, not only for immigrant children, youth, and their families, but also for non-immigrants, when it's kind of assumed that everybody's the same. So that is a topic that I think is really important to be aware about. There's still a lot ongoing in the United States where we have many children and families who are separated. We still have children who are being held. It's been very difficult with policy and to create change that is really humanistic and family oriented. And I know that these things will be coming up, in the next year or so, in terms of federal decisions. And so there'll be topics again. We do see that there, has been quite a lot of support for Dreamers, or students who are part of the DACA program. But even that program has, been in flux. And so those sort of things for immigrant students or undocumented students, those have been significant stress causers and real major things that disrupt their life and their future. So that's, a very particular sub-segment of the Latinx population. But those factors are so critical to their health and well-being that it's something that I think all of us really need to get involved in. We need to be aware of what's going on, and work to make things more humane for everybody.
You've mentioned so many fantastic examples in this interview, particularly all of the activities that you listed. I'm going to try to get a few more of those from you. So I'm thinking from a digital perspective, you mentioned cyberbullying. So what about online communities, your Facebook groups, your websites? Do you have ideas to make those more inclusive?
Yeah, I think it's such a tricky one because the virtual communities sometimes it can be a little bit awkward, right? How do we do that in a way that feels safe? So I think that one's a little tricky. I don't know if I have clear recommendations on that one. I would say, what is interesting to me and that I very much participate in, I love social media. My brother got me into it years ago because he promised he would share pictures of his children. and it took me down this path where I learned that I could connect with virtual communities that I really needed to be part of. So for example, there's not that many Latina professors in higher ed, and only a certain amount at my own university. We do pretty well compared to other places, but when I think about Latina psychologists, having my virtual network of those individuals across the nation at my fingertips on social media has been amazing and supportive and fantastic. And so that's not necessarily a large group. It's not necessarily like inclusive of everybody. Those are actually very kind of specific groups. But being part of that really feels like a safe space to share some things that are really difficult or to get support from people who understand, maybe my job or my background or, other aspects of me. And I know that gets created oftentimes with young people as well. And there's many different virtual communities out there for people. Also, I love Instagram, but I've really been selective about what I follow on Instagram. And there's some wonderful Latinx poets, and there's some wonderful like body positivity, Latinx individuals who are out there who give super interesting messages all the time. So for me, that can be a really restorative place to go on there and see their positive messages or, what's going on in those different communities, or hearing just like the words of the poets or the music. So I tend to be pretty selective about finding what kind of feeds my soul when I go
Mhm.
into those spaces. And I would say you know, I would be a little bit cautious. There are some things I think, like recently, like I happen to love to cook. I actually do love to cook. And somebody recently encouraged me to join a group on Facebook that's all about food. And so that is actually a super
Hmm.
fun and much more inclusive group of people from many different backgrounds and who cook all different kinds of foods. But what brings us together really is, enjoying cooking and sharing tips. And so that space has been, really authentic and fun for me. And the kind of things that I can share and learn from other people um, has been really great. And it wasn't because somebody said, "Oh, you're a Latina, you would like this." It was someone who actually had already followed my posts and knew that I love
Hmm.
to cook and knew that I would share pictures. And they're like, "Hey, I think you would like this other group." And many of those groups really are like invite only, because they try to keep it focused on certain topics, right? So I don't know if that answered your question, but I guess it's just some ways we can keep thinking about and talking about how do we navigate the virtual spaces.
No, that was perfect. I like the idea that you can't necessarily control what others are doing, but you can control what you're seeing. I think I really had a bad relationship with Facebook for a while. I was like, everything I see is just making me angry. It took me a long time to realize, well, I did follow these people
Right.
and I can't hide their posts. So why am I not? And all of a sudden I started joining the groups and it changed and I started enjoying it again. So yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
love
I'm
that.
real intentional about who I follow.
Hmm.
So that it's something that is, when I go there, I enjoy it.
So how did you become interested in Latinx mental health care and researching it and its disparities and so forth?
Yeah, so I'm a Latina. My family is from northern New Mexico. We're the ones that the border
Hmm.
crossed us hundreds of years ago. And we still kept speaking Spanish and, doing our thing and enjoying our culture and heritage and all those things. So I still grew up speaking Spanish and English and, being part of that culture very strongly. When I went to graduate school in social psychology and I started reading about these different topics, I became very interested in
Hmm.
things like gender and race, ethnicity, because I felt like what I was reading did not resonate with my own experience. And I was like, feels really biased. It feels like this is not what I've seen in my family, in my community, in my experience. So I became very motivated at that time. And that was, maybe almost 30 years ago when I started in grad school. So I became very motivated to have a voice in that space and to do research that was, from my own perspective and that could speak to these different topics in a way that felt more representative of what was really going on in the community and also working in partnership with the community. So it didn't feel like we were just taking advantage of the communities and then, faculty were getting, advancement, but the community was never seeing the results or any change. So that was really important to me. And particularly when I went to work with Dr. Robert Roberts and became more aware of the research in mental health with Latinx adolescents and became aware of this finding that even at that time that there was already evidence that Latina girls had the highest rates of suicide attempts and the highest rates of depressive symptoms. And so I felt that that was something that really deserved more attention and it wasn't getting it in psychology. And so I felt like I was somebody who had something to add in that area. And it really took me down, a path that I followed for the last 30 years, doing research and working with communities and working with youth and bringing more attention to these topics through my publications, through my presentations, through activities like this. And So I hope that, that work has made a difference. I hope it's raised awareness with people and, led to some better work out there. And like I said, I was so excited to see today. I was like, the rates of suicide attempts are going down with Latina girls the last, 2017, 2019. So that's encouraging to see that there's a change. And, that's why we do this work, because we really, those of us who are invested in mental health disparities really want to see things improve for individuals. Yeah.
I imagine that there are some people listening right now, and I bet they're thinking, this is really connecting with me. I'm really getting interested in this. Maybe you're an undergraduate out there and you're thinking about where you want to go for grad school, or maybe you're an alumni and you're thinking about going back to school or something like that. Do you have any tips for them on how to get involved or interested in this field?
Do it. I say, do it. We need you. Come back or stay in, graduate. We need you. We need more practitioners. We need more researchers. We need more people who really care about Latinx community, about mental health disparities. We need more work, and we need it to go farther. I mean, I feel like we've made a lot of advancement in the last 30 years, but we still need to do more. There's still a lot of room, especially for developing interventions and prevention work. There's still a lot of room that we need to do, even just in terms of training, so that we have better training for all the counselors, all the clinicians that are out there. And so we need more people like you guys that really are interested, motivated. We need you to get that degree, whether it's the MSW or Master's in Counseling or the PhD in Counseling, PhD in Clinical Work, whatever route you take, there's many different pathways out there. And if you really want to get started, I would say reach out to somebody in your own community, whether it's in your local university or college, or whether it's a practitioner in your community that and talk to them about what they do, what their job is like, what opportunities are there, and get more information. And I'm pretty sure Psi Chi and the American Psychological Association have a lot of information on their website. I know that's a great place to go to get legitimate, authentic, credible information that can really help you get on your way and get started doing this kind of work.
Okay, well, this has been fantastic. I have one last question. So since this is Hispanic Heritage Month, I wondered if you could name a leader who particularly inspires you and that would serve as a good role model for others.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I'm so blessed. I mean, I've had so many wonderful mentors who've helped me along the way and who've, kept me going. But when I think about like a big role model, right, like a big name, somebody who's a significant leader, I really look to somebody like Dolores Huerta, who was one of the leaders and who's still alive. And I think she's in her 90s now and is still going strong. She's still speaking up and advocating and, fighting for social justice. And I've been lucky enough to meet her a few times here in Tucson when she's come for events. And she is like on it. She knows exactly what's still going on, and she'll tell you about topics and she'll tell you what to do. And, so I think she's such a great role model for, somebody who just has that longevity and that commitment to social justice and to advocacy, and who has not been afraid to stand up, use her voice, and also to organize other people. So all those other people who are interested and who care, get them on board and get them helping with a larger cause. So that's who I would say for today, Dolores Huerta.
Okay, well, thank you so much for doing this interview. This has been fantastic.
Great. Thank you, Bradley. It's been really fun.
So you've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. I hope that you'll take some of the information that you heard today and consider ways to apply it to your own environment. Together, we can make our communities more welcoming to people of different cultures. Did you like what you heard in this episode? Then I bet you'll like this too. To encourage more diversity-related articles in Psi Chi's magazine and our journal, did you know that Psi Chi awards a special Diversity Article Award each year? If you'd like to receive one of these $600 awards, all you have to do is submit an article about a diversity-related topic. If accepted, you're automatically eligible, so go check out the specific details at www.psichi.org/diversityinfo. Before you go, I have one other thing to tell you. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, go ahead and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Word of mouth for podcast is a huge help, so share what you heard at the dinner table or in your classes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Psi Chi Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you go for podcasts. You'll absolutely make my day, and more importantly, you'll be helping us get Psych everywhere. Okay, that's all for now. I'll talk to you again soon. Copyright 2021, Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.